Hi, everyone, and welcome to Author Talks, where writers are an open book. I am host, writer, and editor Jane VanVooren Rogers, and I am so excited to be here today with Francine Rodriguez, author of A Woman's Story, a collection of short stories about the Latinx experience. So, Francine, welcome. So excited to have you here today.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here, and I love your intro.
Oh, thank you.
So
Thanks so
upbeat.
much.
Very nice.
Thanks. What's funny is whenever I put on that background music and found that, my family and I will just kind of start grooving to it.
Right. It sort of
We,
pumps
we
you
really
up
like
for the
it.
action.
Yeah. Yeah, kind of that
Definitely.
cumbia beat there. So
Uh-huh.
it's a lot of
Pretty good
fun.
idea.
Thank you. Well, we are here today to talk about A Woman's Story, your collection of short stories. So tell us a little bit more about this. What can people expect from this book?
It's an anthology of 9 short stories. They're all grounded in reality. There were stories that were told to me by women when I was working in the field of law and psychology, and also when I used to do asilo politico, which is political asylum for Central American refugees. Um, Women sort of talked, they were wanting to share their experiences, both here and in another country where they came from. So I sort of synthesized a lot of these in my mind over the last few years, and I was carrying around these stories. And I thought, I'd like to write them to memorialize them and also maybe to get people's attention and let them experience the world through somebody else's eyes. So I wrote up several of the stories and I showed them to friends and family, and it was a no-go. None of them liked the stories. They said things
Oh,
like, oh, well,
wow.
these are too dark, these are too depressing. Um, some people felt they were kind of exploitative of the lives of these women. And I thought, well, there's some rhyme and reason to that. But I still felt the stories were important and I wanted to get them out there. So I finished writing them and I started looking for an agent, and I got some responses, but they weren't what I expected. I heard things like, well, maybe you should change the ethnicity of these women, make them some other, race or denomination, or
Oh
maybe
my
you should
gosh.
change your name, because they told me flat out, it will be very difficult to sell a book about Latinx women, about Latinx period. Or they also told me, why don't you try your hand at an immigrant story? Immigrant stories sell. People read those. And I said, well, there's plenty of immigrant stories. And I know I certainly could write one because I have a lot of background information about that. But I didn't want to write an immigrant story. I wanted to write these stories about women who are already here in their lives. So I went ahead and I started sending out the stories to various literary journals. And the first one I sent out was Smiley and Laughing Girl. That's a story about a formerly incarcerated woman who gives birth to her daughter in jail, and eventually she comes out and tries to raise her in the community where she grew up. And that story got picked up within 5 minutes of my submitting it by one of the journals.
Wow.
It was kind of interesting. I think really that they were interested in it more for the prurient sense. I don't think they had a sense of what gang life was like, especially for a woman, a young woman. And they were talking about how it was dirty realism and they never read anything like that. That's what the editor told me. But he published it. And then I sent out some more stories. And one of the stories, I Still Like Pink, got picked up in the anthology Taboos and Transgressions, which is published by Madville. That's also my publisher. And one also was picked up by Mandy Hayes in a work in progress called Encounter. So after that, I was able to publish the rest of them with Madville, and the anthology is called A Woman's Story. So there you are. We have the book in kind of its origins, and in spite of the critiques, it's still out there, and I still get the same feedback from family and friends. But they say a little less now, now that they actually sit on the bookshelves. And it's been a difficult road to actually see it, out there actualized in real life. But I think it's important. I think that reading it really gives you a perspective and another point of view on the way the world functions.
Mm. Well, that's really surprising to me that you faced resistance from the very beginning, not only from your family and friends, but from um, places that you were trying to market this to or publish
Right.
with. That, I mean, change the ethnicity of the women. That just seems like really bizarre advice to me, and especially in this contemporary era that we're living in of trying to, communicate better across, cultural and racial, divides and understand each other better. I mean, is that something that you even considered at all when you were given that advice?
I listened to it. What I think it always comes down to in the end in this world is money, right? Money kind of controls everything. And I think what they were seeming to say is Latinx literature won't be marketable. It will be difficult to market it. So, why bother? And again, they're in it to make the money, right? There's a profit to be made if there is one. In fact, I was reaching out to bookstores about a month or so back, and I went to the East Coast and I found some bookstores that I liked. Feminist literature looked promising. And one woman told me after I called, well, oh, okay, that's what your book's about, but we already have one book on Mexicans. We don't need any more. And I thought that was pretty funny, ironic, whatever you want to refer to it
Shocking.
as. Yeah.
Shocking,
But
horrifying.
I know when I was talking to Mandy Hayes, who's the publisher of, Wrong Way Back, and one of the other books, Works in Progress, where I have a short story. And she said, no, it isn't surprising. She said, it's definitely something that happens. So I kind of have, been attuned to it. Although, I have to say out here in California, the liberal belt, I guess we say, the independent bookstores, have been very receptive. I've, done several readings. It's been a little harder out here than I see it is in other places because, the culture now around the COVID prohibits so much of the public appearances, especially bookstores, if they tend to be kind of enclosed areas, right? So I've done a number of Zoom appearances for them, but they have been receptive. So that was encouraging. I just wanted to make sure that these women end up getting a voice in literature where I think they belong.
Well, and everyone deserves a voice and deserves equal representation in literature and in life. So it's really surprising and unfortunate to me that, and I guess I don't quite understand the connection with it not being profitable or not selling. Like, I wonder, what are they connecting that with in,
Well, I think the population that, and I can say this in all honesty, I don't see my particular family interested in this kind of literature. And I think it's has a limited venue, and it tends to be more along the sociological lines. I guess somebody who's interested in a culture, a way of thinking, a group of people would enjoy this book. It's not a romance novel or a crime novel or a mystery. And sometimes, these novels get categorized by likes and dislikes. So I guess it has to find its particular niche. Even within feminism, there's a niche there to find. And, how do the stories fit into that particular niche makes it either sellable or not sellable. So I think the variety of stories, though, might reach out to different women who could find something in there of their own life, maybe not within that culture, but some of the themes are universal. These women face exploitation, violence, sexism, racism, interrage, conflicts with family and culture, children, lovers, husbands. And sometimes these women are in a collision with their culture and their community due to their beliefs and due to what is the society today in the United States. Sometimes they face sustained trauma over long periods of time, and it's left them confused and bitter. And a lot of women in general facing these things through our culture, period, forget being Latinx or not, I think would identify with some of these stories.
Well, and I think especially in the story that you mentioned, Smiley and Laughing Girl,
Mhm.
that does talk about gang life and women's roles in that, and I feel like it shows how women get sucked into that and are drawn in by that and then also end up in abusive relationships or potentially being sex trafficked and other elements that go along with that. I think when you read a story like that in your book, it makes that very understandable to understand how women get in those kinds of
Right,
bad situations.
right, right. I think I wanted to portray not just the overview of it, but the background as to how it got to that place to begin with. And I think if you read that, you start to see the origins of some of the conduct and actions that we look at just on the surface. When we look at society or a group of people, we see surface actions, but we seldom really look behind it to see where it originated.
Absolutely. And I think that you're doing important work as a writer in hearing other people's stories and then wanting to, transform that into fiction and share that so that it sheds light on all of these various experiences. So I think that's definitely a valuable thing. And do you feel kind of that responsibility or pressure as a writer to convey those things? Is that
When
what
I
was
wrote,
driving you?
oh, I'm sorry. Yes, when I wrote this book, I did. Also, I had a previous novel, the first novel I wrote called A Fortunate Accident, which is also a real life story. I just simply changed the names, to keep the preservation of the anonymity there. Um, I wanted to convey exactly the picture that is there in reality in day-to-day life of people. That story is about a crooked notario and his victimization of the community. And these stories, all in their own origin, depict different women in different situations, different ages, different occupations or lack thereof, and how they face their daily life, how they sustain. I thought it was important to make sure that I kept as many of the details of reality as possible. Again, I obviously changed names and maybe a few locations just to give it a little more anonymity. But I stick really close to the details, just as I've recorded them in my mind over the time. And I think that's important because changing them too much of a story setting, I think it might make, as the one of the agents told me, make it more mass marketable, but it would lose the authenticity of the story. And it's going to not hit Russian women or Asian women or white women. It's these particular Latinx women. So I had to keep it true as much as possible to actually the lives told to me.
Have you gotten any positive responses personally from Latinas w'ho've read your book and
Yes,
identified?
actually, a few did reach out to me on the, I guess you say the back cover. I had a review from Professor Liliana Gallegos, and she said that the book really brought to attention. She teaches anti-colonialism and at the university, and she said that she saw in this book the evolution, how colonialism had led to certain conditions that are passed down through generations.
Mm.
And I thought about that. Yeah, I hadn't intentionally had that in mind when I wrote it, but I definitely can see the pattern and how it goes back to women of color being at the very bottom of the pecking order, not just here in the United States, but traditionally throughout the world, even in tribal cultures, that was the woman's place. And in the
Yeah.
United States, we had the hierarchy of white male, then white female, then man of color, and woman of color at the very bottom. And you can see that evolution and how it plays out in even our modern day life.
I definitely remember that, studying that in women's studies. I was a women's studies minor, and
Mhm.
the phrase is kind of escaping me, but essentially, someone writing that, about Black women especially being kind of on the bottom of the totem
Right,
pole, and that,
right,
so much is put on them, and like you said, even and especially in tribal cultures, all that's expected, and that really difficult level of physical labor and things like
right,
that are just almost unthinkable in the
right.
Western world.
And how they have sustained so much trauma in their life because of their place in society, which is currently unmodern. It hasn't really changed. Maybe the form has changed over the years, but the status and position has not changed. I have, let's see, 9 different women in my stories. I have a young soldier returning from Afghanistan. I have an elderly woman who's waiting literally to die in her last years on this earth. I have a ER nurse fighting COVID in the time that we live in currently and racism in the hospital that she works at. I have a young woman living on the border edge of poverty, trying to raise a child by herself. I have a formerly incarcerated woman who's trying to raise a child now that she's out in society again. Um, a woman trying to figure out how to identify her sexuality. Should she hide it? Should she release it until a violent act brings out her decision? I have a young woman who falls hard for a fellow grad student from South America and does him a favor by crossing somebody across the border for him. Um,
Mm.
and let me see who else I might have missed here. I actually also have another woman who's married to a Latinx politician who finds some shocking secrets that make her turn around and take a good look at how she's perceiving life. So it is a
Mm.
wide spectrum of women under different
Yeah.
situations.
No, thank you for sharing that. I think that that gives a really nice insight into the diverse perspectives and stories that you cover in this book. And I know that I was really struck by the opening story, 10 Days in May, where you're talking about the ER nurses' experience fighting COVID. It was, you know, not having read a lot of literature yet that covers this time period that we're in, I could recognize right away before you even said COVID that it was like she's writing about right now. So I thought I was really
Right.
drawn in by that, and again the racial and elements of prejudice and discrimination that you cover, I think, in really interesting ways in that story.
It is the most contemporary of the stories because I did write it at this time of COVID. But what I saw was how closely aligned it was with other periods of time and women's experiences. That didn't seem to change. It was so very current. And I found that to be very interesting. Why? That's the question. Why are things this way? Can they change and how do they make them change? So yeah, I found that story to kind of tie in. It was the last story I wrote actually in time. It
Mm.
tied in with the value systems, cultural beliefs that women before had professed.
Can you describe a little bit that story and what's going on there, just to help people understand kind of what we're talking about there?
Yes, this is a story about an ER nurse, and as we said, it's in the time of COVID. She works in an inner city hospital. Obviously, she's going through all the trauma of the COVID overtime, lack of supplies, people dying left and right. Uh, she's supervised by a physician who's from an unnamed Middle Eastern country, but he's himself experienced a lot of discrimination and continues to experience at the hospital from the staff. The patients, some of them are resentful that their medical providers are not quote unquote white people. They don't feel they're getting the care that they should get. They would want to be serviced by white doctors and nurses, and that isn't happening. Um, as she goes through her day, she thinks about her brother who's in prison, in a max security, prison where he's facing the dangers of COVID and there's nowhere for him to go. There's no protection, no isolation. She thinks about that. Her children are at home because obviously they're not going to school right now. She has to leave them alone when she goes to work. Those are, problems that cut across the board for people of color and not of color during this time of COVID. And as she is working there, society is going on. There's a riot in the streets that has political ramifications, and then some neighborhood junkies break in to steal, and the ramifications of their conduct play out and end with a tragedy. All of these things are a continuum, usually in inner city. Sometimes it doesn't happen in other places, but it's different aspects of society coming together at one point around a crisis.
Yeah, that's a great description. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
sharing that. And I was really struck by the quote, I believe, from the doctor who happens to be Muslim, and what they don't realize is the same people that hate me hate them too. And
Right.
it was very interesting because there's basically like a neo-Nazi kind of patient who comes into the ER and as you said, is not wanting anyone but white people to help him. And that's just not the demographics that
Yeah.
that he's dealing with. But I was really struck by that line because it just seems like you definitely are exploring different elements of different groups looking at each other in different ways
Right.
and having those biases.
Their confrontation is pretty much in that setting, and they're forced to confront each other because there's no way out of that setting once they're in there at that time. And what you start to see is that hate and racism are pretty much universal throughout that population. Every group finds somebody else to hate below them because obviously that brings up their level of superiority, or so they feel. And I just think putting all those people together in that one place is going to bring it out. It's going to synthesize all of those emotions and feelings and prejudice. So I guess that story in many ways is, I guess, the most telling of all the stories dealing with racism and oppression. Some of the other stories are more feminist oriented. They deal with specific issues to these women. One of the stories which got the most, can I say, contrary comments from family and friends is about a woman, a domestic worker in one of the really nice houses up in Beverly Hills where she goes every day. She becomes pregnant by her employer, and she decides she's going to go ahead and keep the baby. She doesn't tell him, and then she doesn't tell her husband, and her husband leaves her eventually anyway. So she raises her son, and he's doing very well. He's finishing high school, which is something that never would have happened in her country. She even has hope he'll go to college and get a good job. That's what she works hard for every day. But as happenstance, comes into our life, he meets his half brother, who's the wealthy, privileged son of her employer. And shortly thereafter, upon becoming his friend, he becomes involved in a murder, and he goes to prison for murder, which is something she never would have anticipated. And now she has a decision in her life, and how is she going to go forward? I think sometimes the racial implications are very subtle, because in this story, all the power is with her employer, the connections, the power, everything that could help her son in this situation, keep him from having to go through the court system and get a conviction with a public defender. It's a decision she has to make. Should she reveal the truth of his heritage, or should she just let him go through the system as she would, or would any other Latinx young man who gets accused of murder? I guess some of the stories, as I said, are more overt and some a lot more subtle.
And why do you think that you tended to get feedback that was more controversial about that story?
Well, what people said that are close to me, and they felt comfortable telling me this, is they felt almost a kind of shame-based, can I say, reaction, because there's so much negativity around, well, around right now immigration and Latinx people in a lot of ways. This just didn't paint, they felt, the best picture.
Mm.
And it was almost like you're telling our secrets. People said to me, well, I know this person, it's such and such. I said, no, that's not who it is. There are other people that have these same issues, and you
Oh,
don't know
wow.
this person. I'm pretty sure you don't. But it was almost like we're bringing up the dirty laundry in some instances, because a lot of things that are racially, can I say, responsive or racially based are hidden, or
Mm.
try to be hidden, so that people don't have to say, hey, yeah, this is what I'm going through. And they can try to focus on maybe something that's less provocative. But all the stories, the other story that was commented on, because this has happened in my family, it's happened in others. The young woman who's a soldier returning from Afghanistan, she's fought a war on one continent, and she comes back to find out that her um, brother and her father had been kidnapped by a cartel while they waited across the border to come back to the States. Remember,
Mm.
Trump had everybody waiting outside, right? So they had to wait for a sustained period. And what's been happening is the cartels would kidnap them and ask for ransom, threaten to kill them if they didn't give them a certain amount of ransom, because they were stuck there. They couldn't go anywhere. And that has happened to people I've known, a number of people, and people were saying, oh, yeah, that's us, huh? And I said, no, it's somebody else. That story, though, takes another spin, because the protagonist finds out this information. But there's a question here. Is it really true? Is this really happen? Or is this part of her dysfunctional family who sometimes is on the scam? And she has to find this out, that the people in her family are not always who they portray that they are. So that story got a lot of confrontation. And
Mm.
the one about crossing people, I can personally attest to that, but I won't tell a whole lot about it. But most of us, at one time or other, have crossed or tried to cross a family member across, through the border from Mexico to the United States, and have a lot of intimate details about how that goes down. So people also thought, is that me? No, that's actually me. So yeah, we can personally relate to a lot of the stories. And sometimes people don't feel that comfortable about it.
Well, and I think that's really interesting, because it's like getting the simultaneous messages of, hey, you're kind of hanging out our dirty laundry and we don't appreciate it. But then also saying, hey, is that this person that I know that
Right,
I'm
right.
writing about? Like, it's almost like, well, wait a minute. Like, you're obviously, like, you're finding this relatable and you're relating to this, but you're just saying that you wish that I wasn't writing about this topic.
Right. And
But
I think it did. It hit a lot of nerves, and brought up some things that I didn't know. People start telling me, oh, this happened to me too. And the story about Mrs. Fonseca, who's an elderly woman. She lives by herself in a garage apartment. Her kids obviously are grown, moved on with their own family. She doesn't see or hear from them much. Her husband left her years ago. And she's a very lonely woman. One friend that she had, became ill, and her son moved her to San Diego, so she doesn't see her anymore. It's kind of hard to make friends as you get older, and she's pretty much confined to that little neighborhood. And then lo and behold, two hipsters move next door to her across the way. And she knows that they're hipsters because she sees them in the neighborhood. The neighborhood's becoming gentrified. And at first, it's a very good thing. They're friendly. She can hear their television. She can hear them laughing and talking, the goings on, people coming and going. And it's almost like having entertainment next door. She feels like she's not alone. But then she starts to hear other things: arguing, slamming, crashing, crying. And she notices the woman who comes out once in a while to throw the garbage out, is bruised, looking kind of bruised and battered. And on a very hot August day, she's wearing a heavy black turtleneck covering most of her lower, or I should say upper neck. And she's wondering, well, what's going on? And then she hears some very, very violent confrontations, and it starts to bring back memories of her own life and her own husband. She was also a victim of domestic abuse, but in those days, nobody paid attention to it. You certainly didn't talk about it. And of course, you never reported it to the police. In these neighborhoods, you stay away from the cops. Mm-hmm. And one day she goes to the market and comes home, and the place is surrounded with cops, taped off with yellow tape. And she finds out that the woman next door, who came here to be a screenwriter along with her boyfriend, is dead. And suddenly she's thinking to herself, well, what should I do? Should I talk to the police? Should I tell them what I've heard, what I think I heard? Did I hear that, or did I just think I heard it? And she has a decision to make that drags out her past. And a few people who read that started saying, well, you know, I went through this, and this is how it went down for me. So when I read that, I just got very emotional, and I felt like I was going back in time also. Mm-hmm. So I guess, you know, some of these stories will tap down deep.
Well, and I think it also raises an important question about, you know, how much do we get involved? You know, what is the right balance sometimes when you sense that something is going on in someone else's life that's not good. And again, so many times we all tend to shy away from from getting involved. We don't want to be nosy, or we don't. And like you said, especially with the, you know, the police element and, you know, certain cultures that are more like, oh yeah, no, we're not, you know, we're not contacting them.
And it's dangerous to call the police in these areas. I mean, I grew up and lived in them, and you don't know what's going to happen. It might be worse than what you're going through now, because shootings are random, and police come into these neighborhoods in fear. They're very afraid of people of color, and somebody's likely to get shot, as we see all too often on television. So there's many decisions you have to make sometimes when you want to be of help, but you also worry maybe about your own safety. And plus the fact, if you bring police into the mix, you know, you don't know who in the neighborhood may go after you because they've got something to hide, and maybe they think you're talking about whatever it is they're hiding. So there's a whole lot of factors that have to be, you know, dredged up and sorted, and decisions made. And it's very complex. It's not like in a lot of neighborhoods where the people are not of color, they just reach for the phone. And there's no decision that has to be made. It's an automatic understanding. So yeah, there's love culture touches a lot of things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I just want to show a quick comment from Wondra Chang, who introduced us. She's been sharing some nice comments as we've been talking. She says this book really deserves wider exposure, which I agree, and we're working on that. She was saying that the first story, 10 Days in May, was very moving. And then she also says it's a very smart book. I thought the author's job was to make the reader feel uncomfortable, question, or reevaluate. So do you feel that that's some of what you're doing as an author, is making readers uncomfortable? Do you think that's a key part sometimes of?
Well, yeah, I guess I never thought about it intentionally, but so many people have told me that. As I said earlier, when I showed the stories to friends, these are too dark, these are too edgy. I'm not comfortable reading this. I can't read these. And I thought, well, I guess so. I hadn't thought about it as I wrote them with the intent, but I think it's, what did they say? And one of the reviews said it was dirty realism with a feminist twist. That's how they described the book. And I thought, well, that kind of describes it. It is realism, and sometimes we don't feel comfortable with realism. So I can understand the reaction, but it doesn't change my dedication to putting those stories out there. I was wondering, maybe I should read a little bit.
Yeah, I was going to, sure. Yeah, that would be great.
Okay, so let me find it here. That helps. I'll bring you up to speed here. Oops. Okay, so Smiley is a young woman who grew up in the gang environment, and there are many reasons behind that I won't go into, but you'll also see them when you see her daughter, as I read a little bit about this. So she had her daughter, Laughing Girl, in prison. And then when she got out, obviously her her daughter was in foster care, and she takes her back, and she's trying to raise her in the environment where she lives. And obviously that brings problems. And so she is looking at the problem from her own perspective, and it differs probably from others, but this kind of gives you an idea of where she's at literally. Let's see. After a murder was, I'll just bring it up to speed. After a murder was committed, um, her boyfriend, who was the kingpin in this, um, just lets her out of the car. He reached across me and opened the car door. Don't forget, he pointed to the gun. He gave her a gun that was used in a murder. I stumbled out of the car and ran into the apartment, which had another notice to pay rent or quit taped to the door. I tore it off and threw it on the table. Then I went into the tiny room that I claimed as a bedroom and stuck the gun in the bottom drawer under my bras and panties. There weren't enough to cover it, so I threw some clothes from another drawer on top. Over the next few weeks, everybody spread the word about how they'd found Big Blue dead, and they were looking for suspects. So far, nobody was talking, and I did what Chavo said and stayed away from him. The sheriff even knocked on our door one day, but I didn't open it. I guess they were going around the neighborhood trying to get information. Hiding the gun in the house seemed like a stupid idea. I couldn't sleep one night because I kept seeing the cops busting in and finding the gun. I understood why Chavo didn't want me to get locked up again. I turned over and over in my bed until it started to get light. While everybody else was sleeping, I got up and put the gun in my backpack. I walked all the way to Echo Park and then slowly around the lake. I walked by the usual homeless winos sleeping on the benches and thought about throwing the gun as far as I could toward the center, imagining in my mind it hitting the water, splashing the mud hens hanging around the utility fountain that kept the lake filled with water. But in the end, I couldn't get rid of it. I heard one time they dredged the lake looking for bodies that they thought were dumped there, but all they found were a bunch of rusted weapons and empty bottles. They wouldn't find out this one if they ever dredged it up again. I told myself I'd never be that stupid again. I never let some guy use me like Chavo did. But with Chavo gone, I was kind of lost. I missed the attention, even if it was only lying on his bed and watching TV after he had sex with me. That was kind of like love, I thought, and I wanted to get back to selling dope, but I knew I had to stay away from 18th Street. That's a gang. So I started going to parties and hanging out with some other homies from the avenues. It didn't take long until I found out I was pregnant, but I really didn't know who the father was. Most of the time I was high on coke and weed we used when we partied. You hung with these homies, you were expected to give it up whenever they wanted. So I did. I was so high all the time that I never thought about how I told myself I would never get used again. Then I had some bad luck. When I was 7 months pregnant with my big stomach popping out over the top of my sweatpants, I sold some smack to an underage girl and her friends outside the middle school. She ended up overdosing because it wasn't cut enough, and her friends were able to identify me to the cops. Everybody remembers a pregnant drug dealer with stringy hair and dirty clothes, even a bunch of 14-year-olds high out of their minds. But before they even picked me up, I sold some coke to an undercover cop. I could have sworn he was a dirty street biker. So there you go. I got sent up again. My surrender date was 5 days after Laughing Girl was born. I called her Laughing Girl because she came out smiling and smiled up at me the whole time until they took her away. On the day after she was born, a woman came into my room and said she was from Child Services. She let me hold my baby one last time before she took her. She told me Laughing Girl was going into foster care. I cried nonstop the next few days until I checked into CIW for my second round. I knew better than to go in looking like a weak sister. By the time I got on parole, Laughing Girl didn't even know me. I heard her foster mother cried because she was praying I'd never get out and try to take her back. Laughing Girl cried too. She wanted her foster mom, and I wasn't her. I guess we all cried together. When I got out, I'd figured I'd spent enough of my life paying for stupid mistakes, and I stopped hanging around with anybody from 18th Street or the avenues. I moved back with my mother, and I'm still there. We get along better now. She doesn't drink as much because she has bleeding ulcers. I heard Chavo did a long stretch and then was paroled. His mother called every day and checked in. Funny thing, she likes me now that Chavo and I aren't together. So here I am now, a few more bad relationships and two more kids to raise by myself. And Laughing Girl looks like she wants to follow in my footsteps. I didn't cry much at Chavo's funeral. Enough tears were falling around me to make up for the ones I didn't have. I just closed my eyes and remembered everything that happened between us, our own story. It didn't hurt so much anymore. So much time had passed, I didn't even hate him. After the funeral, I went back to the house. Tonight, my mother will go out drinking with her friends, and I'll be alone with my two boys, unless I can get Laughing Girl to stay in with me. Lately, all she talks about is this guy from 18th Street, Armando. I heard he has two strikes, and he's only been out a few months. She thinks she's in love with him. Later, after my mother went out, I put the boys to bed. I settled down in front of the TV. Laughing Girl finally came home. She pushed the door open and staggered inside. It was almost 10 o'clock. I could see she was drunk or high by the way she moved before I even got a good look at her eyes. Giggling and holding onto the walls, she started toward the bedroom she shared with her brothers. I yelled after her, "Don't make any noise. They're sleeping. Why don't you come in here for a little while?" "I gotta get ready," she slurred. "Ready? Why?" "I'm going out riding," she said. "Mondo's picking me up." I got up and walked toward her. Even a few feet away, I picked up the heavy smell of alcohol and something stronger and more bitter, like the stuff they used to mix paint. No, I thought, she doesn't do that anymore. I saw her a few years back, still in elementary school, sitting by the train tracks with her chola friends, sniffing something they poured into a sock. I stared at her wide, glassy eyes that moved from side to side and didn't see. Her hair was matted and tangled, stiff and crunchy from the mousse she poured on it. Her eyeliner was smeared and most of her penciled eyebrows had been worn off. I followed her to the bedroom where she fell against the wall, trying to find the light switch. Muttering to herself, she stepped out of her tight black jeans and her low-cut blouse that didn't manage to cover her stomach and pulled out a dresser drawer. The dresser stuck, and she fell back on her butt, ending up on the floor sweating. The noise woke up my sons, who were sleeping in a single bed. My younger one pulled the quilt over his head, trying to shut out the light and the noise. I focused my eyes on the glare coming from the single bulb in the center of the ceiling. There was a fresh tattoo on her neck that hadn't been there the last time I'd seen her. I recognized the sign right away. And something else, a hickey, large and red, covering the space under her jawline. The hickey looked fresh. She hadn't been home in a couple of days. "Where have you been?" Chavo's death and the funeral had kept me busy the last few days, and I hadn't seen her. But I couldn't kid myself. She didn't come home some nights anyway. "Answer me, where are you at night?" Laughing Girl zipped up another pair of jeans and gave me a dirty look. "I told you before, I'm with my friends." "You're staying with Armando, aren't you? He's too old for you. He's just going to get you in trouble." The words felt so familiar as I said them. She glared at me. "You don't know him. He loves me." "He doesn't love you. He's just started to use you because you're young and stupid." Laughing Girl whirled around and picked up her hand, bringing it toward my face. I stepped back, surprised. She dropped her hand. "Leave me alone, okay? I hate it here, you and those dirty brats." She brought her hands to her sides and walked back to the living room. "I need some money." "You're supposed to give me some money. That's what you get your welfare for." "I don't have any money. I could barely pay the rent," I told her. "Why don't you get yourself a little job?" "Fuck no," she yelled. "I'm so glad I have Mondo. He said he'll give me anything I need so I don't have to come back here. Tomorrow I'm taking my stuff and moving in with him." "You go ahead and do it," I yelled back. "I'll report him to the cops. You're underage, and I'll call them on him too." "Well, you better not call anybody. Mondo's friends will come after you. You and your other damn kids. Grandma, too." We just stood there looking at each other. "Please don't go out. Just stay here," I heard my voice begging her. "You can't make me stay. I hate it here. I hate you." She slammed the door as hard as she could, making the walls shake, and then it was silent, except for the low hum of the TV. I sat down on the couch and stared at the wall. There would probably be quite a few Mondos in her life before she figured it out, if she ever did. But right now there was only this one, and I wanted him gone. I'd seen the car he drove, and I knew more or less where he stayed. But all that could be figured out later. I still knew a few homeboys from 18th Street and even a couple from the avenues. It was smart not to let go of your connections, even if you didn't hang out with them anymore. Chavo still owed me, even if he was dead, because he never paid his debt when he was alive. I'd kept my mouth shut, like the homie said. So it was time to reach out to them and collect. Chavo's homeboys knew how to set up a rival with guns and drugs. They even did it for some unsolved murders that the cops had given up a long time ago. They were willing to take that snitch call. That was insurance that someone would get busted and sent away, especially if that someone was looking at 3 strikes. They did it all the time. I lit a cigarette and sat back. The problem was, if I asked the homeboys for their help to pay back Chavo's debt, I would end up owing them in the future, whenever and whatever they wanted. That's how it worked. Who knows what they would want me to do for them? I could end up back in prison, or worse, end up dead. They might do away with my kids if I didn't do what they said. No, I didn't want to owe them anything. I didn't want to owe anybody. I was done with that. I'd paid enough already. I went back to the small bedroom, the one I shared with Laughing Girl when she was around. I leaned all my weight against the heavy oak dresser and pushed it away from the wall. Behind the dresser, I dug out a piece of the linoleum that covered the floor. The space was about a foot wide, and the shoebox that I'd put the gun in fit just fine. The shoebox was covered with plywood, and in case anybody got that far, I'd nailed the piece of linoleum back over the space. I carried Chavo's gun with me everywhere I'd lived so far, hiding it just in case anybody came looking. Just a week or so ago, I figured I'd finally get rid of it. So much time had passed by now, but I hadn't got around to it yet. Under the bathroom cabinet was a rusty hammer, the one I used to nail a board over the broken part of the window in the bathroom and to hang my son's school pictures over the table in the kitchen. I bent down next to the dresser and used the claw side of the hammer to remove the nails holding the linoleum. It took me a long time, but I kept at it until I reached the shoebox. Sitting back on my heels, I lifted out the gun and turned it over in my hands. There were enough bullets in the chamber. I unlocked the safety and examined it. It was just the way it was after Chavo used it in the murder and gave it to me. I felt relaxed now. I went and sat back on the couch. When I got locked up and started doing my time, the day they took away my baby, I said there was no justice for people like us, not unless we made it ourselves. There were a lot of things I couldn't do for my daughter, but I could do this right now because I wanted something better for her, even if she didn't. But maybe someday she would.
Thank you so much for that. That was a nice taste. And I was so struck by that last line.
Maybe she would.
I had jotted down a paraphrase before we got on because I was like, that line about, I want better for her even if she doesn't want that for herself yet. And you definitely, I think, crank up it's like you feel the emotional weight as you're reading of the things, that you're talking about and being in those kinds of situations. Did you feel that emotional weight as you were writing about these characters and their situations? I mean, and I say characters because, of course, I know that much of this was inspired by real people that you were listening to.
I think every parent, universally wants better for their child. It's just that often the better is controlled by the environment they are born into. And what she said about there is no justice unless we make it ourselves is very, very true in many of these communities. And the justice she knew is street justice. And that's the only way to make this better world for her daughter. So she has to take it into her own hands, and that's how she feels, and she feels she has the means to accomplish it. It isn't a question of, going to the cops or going to the social worker, because that's just going to cause more problems in her life. It's just as her daughter said. So, in her own self-reliant way, she feels she's handling the problem the best way she can.
Well, and also that pain and that tension when you see your child going down the same road that you were on. And so when she says, she's probably going to have several different Mondos in her life and that kind of thing too, that can be really hard to witness that.
Right. And she's in a position where she has, obviously done some time, so she knows the ramifications of the conduct. She wants to put a stop to it the only way she knows how, or she thinks she knows how. A lot of people in this environment don't know the ramifications because maybe they haven't gone that far into the system, and it becomes normalized behavior. So it's a very difficult lifestyle to leave. It's generational, I would say, in a lot of times.
And I think you capture that well in that story for sure. And even just the portion that you just read to us, I think it shows how it's an intergenerational element that, it's hard to escape that. How do you get away from that when that's the situation that you're in? It's what you've seen, it's what you've experienced, and now it's like her daughter is also going into that.
Right. And that maybe is a realization that you come to the end, but where do you go and how do you move forward? It's a question that society, throws out all of the time, and sometimes in phases where society is interested in seeing how they can move a generation up, lift them up. But many times, as the times we're in now, that's not the question on everybody's lips. There are other questions that people are dealing with, the sociological questions, economic questions, and those things fall by the wayside. Children fall by the wayside.
Well, what do you hope that readers take away from A Woman's Story?
I hope that, as I said, they get to see the world through somebody else's eyes, somebody that they would not normally have the opportunity to visit in their world. They get to go into another world and just see how the perspective, plays out. There's a number of different scenarios, and I just think, even for myself, it was somewhat of a venture. It was a privilege to share these worlds with these women. Their worlds are different than mine. They're different than others. And everybody has a particular milieu they grow up in and they live in and they move ahead in. And I just think, unfortunately, there's the way our society is structured, all of these different environments are segregated in many ways from each other. And then, too, I'm hoping people reading it see a crossover between a lot of the issues that were not merely cultural or sociological, but they were common to women, common to people in general. I think in the end, there are more of those than differences.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Do you have any thoughts as well on kind of, how to overcome some of those barriers that you've come up against when you're trying to write and share a wider, diverse experience, and sort of being pigeonholed into, again, like, oh, we have a Mexican book, or we have a book about, Mexicans, and understanding that it's like, okay, like, yeah, it is hard. And I mean, especially when you had reached out to a bookstore, and I'm sure that's probably, I mean, I'm sure you probably never dreamed of getting that response.
That was quite a reaction. I hadn't heard that. You hear like, oh, no, we're not buying any, fiction now or whatever. That, normal. But that was actually the response that I got from family and friends, telling me that you won't be able to move this book forward, because that's what they say. And this is the truism. They say nobody is interested in the lives of Latinx women or Latinx period. And, I have to be candid. I did hear some of that in reality as feedback on what I had written. And I don't know any other way other than just bringing forth the stories and getting them as much, can I say, notoriety as possible. I'm writing another book now, which is 360 degrees different, but it's actually about a young woman who's involved in the neo-Nazi movement and her life.
Mm,
And as I started writing it, also this is based on another real person, thought, wow, there are similarities, a whole lot of similarities to female gang life in the Latinx community. And
mm.
I hadn't thought about that until I started writing. So again, some of these problems cross cultures and beliefs and lifestyles. They just may be on the other side of the board. Um, I just think exposure is important, for people to realize that there's more to the world than their little corner, with their comfort zone. And I think maybe that's how I feel. I want to take the reader out of the comfort zone of the standard cozy mystery or romance novel, or and write something a little different. And I guess I have to have the attitude that, well, if it's not excuse me, received, at least I tried to bring it forth. And that's how I think I have to proceed when I hear all the, oh no, don't write about this or don't write about that. Well, at least I can say my stories have a different authenticity than many other books, and I'm hoping it will be appreciated.
Well, and maybe it might just take a little bit longer for, people to become aware, of your book and aware of those kinds of stories. And then hopefully, over time, people will begin to understand and value that more. And when you were talking about the realism aspect, dirty realism, it was making me think of, your writing style reminds me of Raymond Carver, somewhat, and what he, did with his stories as far as, more like for white working class,
Right,
people,
right.
lower class people. And so I would hope that too, it's, I think your writing is on that level. And I think it's, I think it's, something, as you said, that can be learned from. We can all learn from other people's experiences, and especially when they're different from ours.
And the one thing, just kind of concluding, I thought of when you were talking right now, before you were even born, I'm pretty sure, there was an author, John Ricci. I think he's still around. In fact, I studied with him about 10 years ago. I took a writing class with him. And he wrote these books called Numbers. What is it? I can't even think of all the names of the books, but they were the first books written about gay life in Los Angeles, and particularly the area I grew up in the 50s and 60s. And wow, you think about that. That was something unheard of. City of Night is the book. I skipped my mind for a moment.
Oh, sure.
Classic. It's still a classic. It was the first of its kind. And I can imagine what people said in the 50s and 60s, because he was very graphic. He described a day in the life of a street hustler and how he got to be a street hustler and so forth and so forth. It was autobiographical, he said. And it still, if you read it, will take you back and you go, wow, this guy really is on point to this lifestyle. So I think about that, and I think if people like him could come forth and tell their truth and be honest, well, heck, I should be able to do that too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And just because something might be slightly before its time or before its peak in popularity, I think so many times that happens with authors too, where they at the time, it's kind of the classic scenario,
Right, right,
at the time that they're writing, they're not really fully recognized or fully appreciated, and it might take a little bit more time before you know I don't want it to, believe me. I want people to go get this book right now and go read it and
well, thank you.
explore, explore the stories that you're talking about, because they do have value. Um, and I think that, again, just in trying to capture that and share that, from a writer's perspective, based on the kinds of real life stories that I think that's always worthwhile. And it disappoints me that you've sort of gotten discouragement on that. So
Well,
I'm glad that you kept going.
yeah, I
And
think
that you didn't
sometimes
allow
that
that to
is
stop you.
Yeah, it will just push you forward on your nature, and that's my nature. So contrary, I guess. So that just encourages me to write more of the same. I really appreciate having the opportunity to talk with you and to introduce the book. And I've really enjoyed spending this time with you today. Thank
Well,
you very much.
well, thank you so much. Thank you for being here with us. And do you have any advice for fellow writers kind of to end on?
Oh, I think that you have to tell yourself all the time as you write that what you're writing is your truth. It's important to you. And there are people out there who are going to want to read it. I think you have to keep that in mind as you put your story to paper, so to speak. And, they say write about what you know. And I think there's some truth to that. But I think there's room for all kinds of writing. And even if it's research writing or supposition writing, it's somehow your truth and you have input into it. And that's what you need to keep moving forward with and not to get discouraged. As long as you have that story to tell, you make sure you tell it.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for those encouraging words. And thanks again, Francine, just for taking time out of your day to be here. And I
Thank
hope
you.
everyone will go get a woman's story, and that also we can share this and help promote it and get the word out there.
Thank you so much. I hope you have a very good day.
Yeah, thank
And
you.
we'll talk again, I hope, sometime.
Yeah, sounds great. Sounds great.
Okay.
Well,
You take care.
yeah, you too. Thank you so much,
Thank
everyone,
you.
for being here with us,
Bye-bye.
and we'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.